I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Paul Thagard, a philosopher, cognitive scientist, and author of many interdisciplinary books. He currently teaches as a distinguished professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of Waterloo, where he founded and directed the cognitive science program. Dr. Thagard is a graduate of the Universities of Saskatchewan, Cambridge, Toronto with a PhD in philosophy, and Michigan with an MS in computer science. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the Cognitive Science Society, and the Association for Psychological Science. The Canada Council awarded him a Molson Prize in 2007 and a Killam Prize in 2013. So, Paul, welcome and thank you so much for joining me today. So
Oh,
today,
thank you very much.
so today we're talking about substrate-independent minds. This is a big topic. I'm really excited about this. This is something I've been following for a long time. But before we get into that, I want to start out by asking about your books because you have written, you've written many books. You have a ton of papers in Google Scholar. I'm going to put links to all of those in the show notes, right? So people watching this can scroll down and see what you've written. But I wanted to start out with your new book called Balance, How It Works and What It Means that just came out. Can you tell me a little bit about this new book and how it relates to what you've written in the past?
Well, the book on balance was inspired by an attack of vertigo that I had in 2016. I was lifting weights in my basement, and when I got up, the room started to spin. And this was an extremely strange experience. I knew what it was because I've known people who've had vertigo, but I'd never had it like this before. And so I wanted to know why. Fortunately, when I saw my doctor the next day, she quickly diagnosed me with a fairly benign kind that's fixable by head exercises. So it hasn't been an ongoing problem, but it got me really interested. What's going on in the mind when the room starts spinning? This is an incredible illusion. I wasn't on drugs or alcohol or anything like that. Why is the room spinning? It's a conscious experience of an extremely complicated sort. So I wanted to know, given my background in theoretical neuroscience, what's going on in the brain that makes this happen? So that was the main encouragement to get into the topic of balance. But when I started working on it, I kept noticing the word balance cropping up everywhere. For example, in the beginning of the pandemic, people were talking about how do we manage a work-life balance? That is, how do you get a balance between making people go into quarantine and letting them run their lives? And of course, we always talk about work-life balance in other contexts too, like how do you manage your family? And so I started noticing that balance wasn't just neurological phenomena, it was a social phenomena with lots of metaphors that govern our lives. So the book has these two parts. One gives a neural explanation of how we balance, but the other part looks at all these metaphors for balance that I think are really fascinating.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. And again, the book title is Balance, How It Works and What It Means. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes for that. So let's get into substrate independent minds. Again, this is a big idea. It's something that deserves more attention. In Psychology Today, you wrote an article that defines this as minds that are multiply realizable, which means they can, in principle, operate in various non-biological systems, such as computers. So it's kind of a wordy explanation. Is there kind of a simple version of that that would help people understand?
Yeah, probably the simplest way to understand it is to look at different kinds of computers. So consider a Macintosh computer that works on Mac chips, which are different from the Intel chips that PCs use. But even though they've got very different chips, very different hardware, they run the same software. So you can run Microsoft Word on either one and it behaves pretty much the same. And so that's a case where the software is independent of the hardware. And so that's what substrate independent means. It suggests that what really matters is the software and it can run on any different kind of hardware. And since the 1960s, philosophers thought, well, maybe this tells us something important about the nature of mind. Maybe it doesn't matter that our minds have run on our brains. We could run them on computers as well. And of course, in the 60s was the beginning of artificial intelligence and the idea that you can make a computer smart as well. So I think this was a really interesting idea that what we think of as intelligence, which is basically a matter of software rather than a matter of the particular kinds of hardware.
Ah, well, so this ties in with the concept of mind uploading. And I think various people have read about that. Obviously, this is a trope in many different movies, but the benefits of this go way beyond that. I mean, it's we're talking about the feasibility of human level artificial intelligence. So on the one hand, we've got AI systems that could be as intelligent and respond and interact just like a human being, right? So we could interact more efficiently with them. We also have the potential for a form of human immortality, digital immortality that can be achieved by uploading brains into computers. And then there's also the idea, I think it's kind of a corollary of this, that we may all be living in a computer simulation, maybe like the Matrix, but in the Matrix, they have real bodies, and maybe we're just a simulation to begin with. So there's three of the biggest themes in modern science fiction right there, and it sounds like one technology enables all of them. Is that accurate?
That's right. But the problem is that all of these amazing technologies you just described, they don't argue for substrate independence. They just assume it. They assume that if you can upload your brain into the computer will have the same experience as you do. They assume that if we're a computer simulation, that somebody's running a program 1,000 years from now, it's going to have the same experiences that we're having right now. They assume that artificial intelligence is automatic because it doesn't matter that we have brains and computers have chips. But these are just assumptions. And I think that assumption is false, that in fact, it does matter what the hardware is, that the idea that hardware doesn't matter, that it's just all software that makes all these other wonderful science fiction fantasies realizable, isn't actually true.
Yeah.
So
Well, no, and I definitely want to get into that later because I think there's a ton to that, and your background is absolutely perfect to speak to this. But before that though, one of the things, and this is just my own personal experience, I toured a data center in 2012, I think, and they had racks and racks and racks of servers. And in their case, they were running operating system software for web servers, and they were doing it as hypervisors, I believe. I think that was the word. And so the machine itself had its own little operating system, and they were running an operating system on top of that. And I'd asked, well, what is the benefit of doing it like this? And one of the things that they'd said to me was, they said, well, if the machine itself has hardware problems, which they do every now and then, it will automatically pause the system, pause the software, and move it to another machine. And I said, well, how do you know which one is on which machine? And he said, well, it really doesn't matter. The system keeps track of that. So we don't know where it's running, and we don't really care. We just know that it's somewhere on the network, and it's running as if it's on its original machine. And at the time I was reading about mind uploading, and I thought that could be the ultimate future for this. I mean, you have, if they were able to make it work, you could have human intelligence, and it would be hosted somewhere, but you wouldn't know where, and it wouldn't matter. It would be substrate independent.
yeah, well, that's a beautiful idea. But in the case you described, you've got a bunch of computers that are basically all the same computer. It's all the same hardware. And even if it was a little bit different, and if it was shifting, say, from a PC to a Mac, the hardware is similar enough that the same software runs on all of it. But now, is it true that the kind of thinking ability that humans have is independent of the fact that we have our brains working? And that seemed quite plausible back in the early days of cognitive science, back in the 60s, when the idea of mind as computer got originated. But I started to wonder about this back in the 80s, because there were two major developments in the 80s. One was ideas about neural networks. And so we started to think about computational neural networks operating in parallel. So why do you need parallel computation? If you've got a fast computer, you can just do everything serially, but it'll be fast enough to work. But nevertheless, people got interested in parallel computation. The other big development that took place is brain scanning. And so psychologists in the 60s and 70s just thought of the mind as a computer. But in the 80s, we started to be able to use brain scanning technologies to find out what's going on in different parts of the brain. And more since then, there's been an explosion of knowledge about how the brain works. And if we look at how the brain actually works, as opposed to thinking of it as an abstract computational device, you see a lot of things going on that are different from the computers that we use today. We've got 100 neurotransmitters, 100 different kinds of neurons. You've got different brain areas doing different sorts of things. And I think as we've gotten to know more about the brain, it's become less and less plausible that the hardware doesn't matter. It matters a lot that we have all these neurotransmitters and brain areas that are doing complicated things. So the idea that it should be easy to just put electrodes in our brain and basically look and see what the neural connections are, upload that to a computer, and it will be just like us. In fact, it would be us on this fantasy you described, I think is extremely implausible because it's presenting an oversimplified view of how brains actually work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that this vision started around, circa 2000, right? There was a movie called The 13th Floor that kind of talked about it. The Matrix, I think everyone has seen The Matrix. That's probably the best example of it. Lawnmower Man back in, I think that was the early 90s, late 80s. That was another example of this in terms of the mind uploading part of it. So
Mhm.
I mean, there are big ideas. It's really exciting. As you've said, it's kind of a fantasy, but there are also big challenges in terms of even attempting to implement it. So one of the areas, I mean, just starting at the basic level, we still don't understand qualia. We don't have solutions for the mind-body problem or the hard problem of consciousness, right? I mean, we can't move those onto silicon, until we understand what they are.
Well, we could probably learn about a lot by trying to upload them onto silicon. So qualia is what the philosophers term for conscious experiences. And we all have lots of them. We have our perceptions, our sensations, our thoughts, our emotions. So, and now we're getting a better and better understanding of how the brain does these things. And so is that going to make it easy for us to get our perceptions and our emotions running in a computer? Well, actually, I think as we learn more about these things, it makes it suggested it's going to be harder than we thought. And one of the reasons it's harder than we thought is that a lot of what our brain does depends on inputs from our bodies. So our bodies are doing very complicated sorts of things. We've got our breathing rates and our heart rates and all our hormone levels, and all of this is being reported up to the brain, which is doing very complicated kinds of computations. Similar to the balance that you asked about earlier. So when we keep balance, it's an amazing interactive process where our body signals from our sending signals from our hands and our feet and from our eyes and from our inner ear, especially. The inner ear is really important. That's where vertigo usually starts. So you've got all these signals coming from the body. And in order to have vertigo, you need to have the complex interpretation of them that the brain does. But without the bodily input, you just wouldn't have the conscious experience of vertigo. You wouldn't have the conscious experience of feeling worried that you're having vertigo. And so how that goes on depends on many different interacting parts of the brain based on lots of different kinds of inputs from different parts of the body.
Yeah. Well, and on top of that, mental processing and perception are affected by emotions and the state of you mentioned the state of the body, emotional states as well. The brain operates differently during sleep and dream states than it does during the day. We also have, I mean, we have our daily biorhythms, we have monthly cycles. I understand that we have some kind of an annual cycle as well. And so, we have hormone levels and various biochemistry changes that happen throughout the day, month, year, and they all affect how the brain works. So we're not just recreating a static mind and trying to upload that or reproduce that, I guess, but something that's dynamic. It's always changing, right?
Exactly. And the brain somehow puts this all together. How does it manage to do that? Well, it's basically working with 500 million years of evolution. So brains have been around since there have been animals, and neurons starting at fairly simple levels have gradually scaled up so that we've got our 86 billion neurons that are doing these very complicated kinds of computations. And I think the idea that it should be easy to transfer this into a computer is extremely naive. I'm not saying it's impossible. I just think it's way more difficult than a lot of people currently realize.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and one of the examples that it keeps coming into my mind is my alarm clock, and maybe because it's simple and basic, but when I go to bed at night, I feel very differently about my alarm clock than I do at 6 a.m. the next morning. And I would assume that most people do as well. And so even if we were able to say, okay, this is an alarm clock, and we're going to have this correlation of different properties associated with it. And I think that that's something that's kind of come out of the big data world. They're saying that we can take an object and represent that digitally and then have all of the properties and associated memories and all of that. Those are weighted differently depending on our emotional state, depending on all of these different cycles that affect us. So,
Mhm.
well, so in 2021, you published a paper entitled Energy Requirements Undermine Substrate Independence and Mind-Body Functionalism. And so in that paper, you criticized substrate independence for not paying enough attention to energy requirements. I'm wondering, could you tell me a little bit about the thesis in that paper?
Okay, well, think about how intelligence operates in the real world. It's not just abstract thinking. When we operate in the real world, when we're walking along the street and trying not to fall over or trip or lose our balance in that way, there's lots of things going on all at once. And it's got to be done reasonably efficiently, because if we're out in the wild and say we've been hiking for 3 days, we got to make sure we've got enough food. If we don't have enough food, then we don't have enough sugar to keep our brains working. The brains take enormous amount of energy. They take about, even though it's a small part of the body, it takes about 20% of the glucose that our body uses as fuel. And so the energy is really important there. Of course, energy matters to computers as well, because you need to have the electrical energy to keep the whole thing working. But these are different ways in which energy operates. Our brains operate on biochemical energy, whereas the electrical energy is all that the computer needs. Does this matter? Well, it matters a lot, because if you don't have enough energy, then you can't do all the things that mark you as intelligence. So what I did in the paper was to look at various ways in which both biological systems and computational systems are really affected by the source of energy that are crucial for keeping it going. And one thing that I was able to show, both by looking at biological systems and computational systems, is that energy really depends on substrate.
Hmm.
Because if you're a computer and if you've got chips, well, all you need is electrical energy. But if you're a brain and you're working with neurons, then you need the biochemical energy that comes through glucose. And these operate in different ways, and they have different kinds of requirements. So to simplify the argument, it's that energy depends on substrates, thinking depends on energy, and so thinking depends on substrates. And so it shows a way in which you can't simply abstract away from what the hardware is, because different kinds of hardware need different kinds of energy that they gain from interacting with the world. So interacting with the world and getting the energy to keep your intelligence rolling is a big part of being smart.
Ah, well, everything that we've talked about so far is very mechanistic in nature, but it seems like it takes us, it seems like it's a slippery slope into some really deep philosophical areas. And like, for instance, one of the things that this leads me to ask is consciousness a state rather than simply information and processing? And if that's true, in a sense, I've heard this before, do we die every time we go to sleep at night?
Well, no, we we lose consciousness when we go to sleep at night, but our life is not just consciousness. You can be unconscious and still be fully alive. So consciousness stops, but of course, there's a really interesting problem there to be solved. What happens when consciousness stops when we go to sleep, or if we get hit over the head? So we need a theory of consciousness to do that. Now, I think we're on the cusp of having a
Hmm.
neurocomputational theory of consciousness. Uh, I've got my own version of it. Other people have got different kinds of theories, but I think that's good, becoming quite possible to think about how the brain, and so far the only things that are conscious are things that have brains. So we need to be explained, how does the brain achieve consciousness? And I can tell you what I think the key parts are. One is that we've got neurons that can represent the world. Another is that the representations that neurons produce can be bound into more complex ones. So you can think about walking and talking at the same time, and it has to be coherent. And so I've got a neural theory of coherent that explains how to do that. And on top of that, I think the fourth big mechanism that operates in the brain is competition. So you're only consciously aware of a tiny part of what your brain is doing at this time. You have no idea what's going on in most of your brain areas or what the 86 billion neurons are up to. So there's a kind of competition among all the processes going into the brain for what's most important, and that what goes through to consciousness. So I think these processes, neural representation, binding, coherence, and competition are the keys to explaining consciousness in a really, frankly, mechanical way. It's a much more complicated machine than humans have ever built. It's much more complicated than the computers we have now. But I think, nevertheless, we can get an explanation of consciousness that's fully mechanical, because these are the four mechanisms that add up to consciousness.
Well, the reason I'd asked the earlier question, and it sounds like you're on the, again, you mentioned being on the verge of kind of a solution for this, but this dovetails in with mind uploading. I've read discussions of this that suggest that you would have to gradually upload a mind and maintain consciousness during the process to actually upload it. Otherwise, you would just be basically copying it and losing the original. And again, these are these fine, blurry distinctions, right? And so,
Yeah, but first look at the problem of uploading it. So if you want to take emotions, for example, I've got a neural theory of emotions that I think is pretty good. But it depends not just on your abstract evaluation of the situations you're facing. That's part of it. Are you happy or sad because you're accomplishing your goals? But also depends on what's coming in from your body, what's going on in your heart and your lungs and your hormones and all your different neurotransmitters. So there's incredibly complicated kinds of inputs go into you having an emotion. So have an emotion uploaded to a computer, you'd have to be able to duplicate all of that. And we don't have a clue how to do that. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying that the thought experiment says, oh, we can just upload our minds to computer. It's extremely naive. It's like saying, oh, I can translate myself right now to transport myself to Alpha Centauri. Well, easy to imagine, but incredibly hard to do in practice. And I think the same thing is true for uploading. So
yeah.
the problem you mentioned of stopping and starting is fairly trivial compared to how do you get all of these bodily dependent activities of your brain to operate independent of the body. That, I think, is a much more fundamental problem that we don't even have a clue to begin with yet.
Yeah. Well, uploading specifically is, again, this is a form of near-term immortality, right? And I think most people would do nearly anything to cheat death if they had that opportunity. And, I guess from another perspective also, every time a person passes, that loss of learning and wisdom is truly immeasurable. So do these factors, do you think that they'll continue to drive research into this area despite these massive challenges?
Well, I actually don't have that goal for immortality. Woody Allen said, I don't want immortality from my work. I want it from not dying. But what's so great about not dying? It could actually turn out to be rather boring if you manage to live for 1,000,000 years. So I don't see that, frankly. It's partly because I don't have fear of death, because I've long since abandoned my religious upbringing. And from that point of view, this was something that was recognized even by the ancient Greeks. When you're dead, there's nothing to fear because there's nothing happening. And so I frankly don't find death is so scary. And so I don't see immortality as such a goal. What I would like to see is for people to keep on having as good lives for as long as they can, which sometimes, given modern medicine, can last, well, 80 or 90 years. So that's all great. But the idea that we should be desperate to live forever strikes me, frankly, as a vestige of religion best abandoned.
Yeah, well, and I'm going off my questions list, but I think what you're describing, I've read about this, is described as the health span versus the lifespan, right? And lifespan will be, overall how long a person is alive, but health span are those healthy, productive years where a person feels good and, and they're not, I guess, troubled by various diseases. So
yeah, which is really valuable. So that certainly is a wonderful goal. But the idea that we can gain immortality by uploading our brains, first of all, seems to me not practicable, at least for centuries. And secondly, not even especially desirable. What would be the point, for example, if you managed to upload your abstract thoughts about philosophy or science or technology, but it didn't come with the emotions? That is, if it didn't come with the excitement or the satisfaction that came with accomplishing things. So emotions are a really key part of what makes our lives enjoyable and meaningful. That's all great. So if you screwed up the emotions, but according to my theory of neuroscience and lots of other people's too, our emotions very much depend on the kinds of bodies we've got. And so if you put your so-called emotions into a computer that doesn't have any kind of bodily inputs, is it going to have the same experiences? Well, I think not. I think it could be something that just is just utterly dismal and gray.
Yeah.
So I don't see this happening in many, many hundreds of years. The idea that we're close to it, that we're close to being able to do this, is just astonishingly naive. Brains are way more complicated than that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, from what I understand, Elon Musk's Neuralink is one of the startups taking the first steps towards mind-machine integration. And I don't know if they've looked at uploading or not. And as you just said, even if they are, that could be hundreds of years away in the future. But what are your thoughts so far on their work in terms of a basic mind-machine integration? And do you think that this is kind of a first step that might inspire other companies to follow in their footsteps?
Well, I think Neuralink's aims are more medical. They're trying to help people with really serious problems. I hope they're successful, because you have people with strokes or with spinal cord damage, and it really would be great if a kind of computer interface could help people with that. But it's important not to be naive about that. I'd looked at their website, and it looks like they're assuming that it should be possible because, after all, the brain is an electrical machine. Well, it is. It's got electrical activity, but it's also a chemical machine. For example, the brain isn't just a matter of synapses and neurons firing. You have, as I said before, more than 100 different kinds of neurotransmitters, and they matter a lot, for example, to emotions. And so the idea that there's going to be some easy way to get these kinds of connections working, I think, is quite naive. But of course, you may not need to have all that. I mean, already there are brain implants that are helping people with depression and Parkinson's. So there are ways of having brain simulations. But to get it working so that people could be able to walk again is going to require more complicated kinds of computations. So I hope it works, but I imagine the people doing it are already aware that the operations of the brain are not always that easy to connect with, because you're dealing with these embodied chemical processes as well as the electrical activity that occurs in the brain.
Yeah, there is so much to it. I mean, it does seem though like there would be vast social changes if this technology was realized. Like right now, our world is built on the transfer of wealth and knowledge from one generation to another. If we somehow removed mortality from the equation, or at least change the way that it operates, at the very least, it seems like it may halt human evolution in some ways. And at most, it might stand in the way of our children, right? So,
well, but look at how human knowledge works. I've got a lot of knowledge in my brain, and 30 years from now, that brain will be defunct. But that doesn't matter, because an awful lot of what I know, I've written down. I've written it down in many books and in blog posts and in articles and things like that. So human technology changed dramatically 10,000 years or so when we became literate. That provided us with the ways of getting our knowledge written down so that future generations could acquire it fairly easily. And so the fact that we've got mortality facing us, that doesn't matter that much if we can get our knowledge written down and established in computer programs and in giant databases and Wikipedia. That's all wonderful. And so the human knowledge isn't threatened in the way that you're describing just because individuals die.
mm. Well, there's another aspect to this as well. I'd wondered if once people are uploaded, if they have these vast capabilities, I mean, the ability to access and process, large amounts of information, all of those kinds of things, if they may not end up looking down on normal humans as being vastly inferior, I guess. And again, it's another pie in the sky idea, but
Yeah.
it was interesting to ponder.
That's possible. It certainly would be a big advantage. I've just increased my productivity in a notable way by trying out the new chatbot, ChatGPT, from Amazon, from OpenAI. And it's really quite amazing. I've been following artificial intelligence for many decades, and this impresses me more than anything I've ever seen before, because you can put in very complicated questions. And I've been throwing some actually really tricky questions from philosophy and neuroscience at it, and it comes up with these really good answers that are not only on the mark, but actually very well written. So I've never seen an AI program that impresses me as much as ChatGPT. So obviously this is enhancing my own work already, because I'm starting to ask it queries that I can then get stuff that I can turn into prose for my own work. And you could imagine that if this was not just something where I had to type it in, but I had a brain implant so I could access all this time. Why is ChatGPT so good? Well, it's because it's based on a neural network that has learned from exposure to millions and millions of different documents. So it's got all of Wikipedia and countless books on Google Books. And so it's got this huge amount. And so if I didn't have to use the computer interface, but could get that directly into my brain, that would really be quite amazing. So I love the ideas of these kinds of technological developments, but I don't think they're going to render humans obsolete in any way at all.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're describing is what they've been calling human machine teaming, and I may be using that incorrectly. But one thing that occurs to me is the Google Scholar page you have. I mean, you have written dozens of papers. Now, a machine that could go through those more like a human being and understand contextually what matters, you might be able to ask it a question in your own work, and it could find the references that fit better than you might be able to. It might be able to save you countless hours of time, right? So,
Yeah, well, I can't always remember the articles that I published because there's some of them were published a long time ago, but it can actually make connections. So there's this, I asked ChatGPT today, what's the relation between Plato's allegory of the cave and the ancient Chinese myth, story about a philosopher dreaming about a butterfly and wondering if he's a butterfly dreaming about being a philosopher. And it got it. It immediately told me Plato's story and it got it right, and the Chinese philosopher's story and it got it right, and it described, I'm hesitate to use the word understand because this is basically a statistical parrot, but it looked like it understood the relation between the two of them, because it realized, and I've never seen this written down anywhere else, that Plato's story and the Chinese philosopher's story are making the same point, that we could be wrong about reality. So I was just astonished, and it produced this in polished prose that I expect from a good graduate student. So this is the sort of thing that's becoming possible, and I think it's just wonderful. I like this kind of technology. On the other hand, I'm not worried about Chat GPT or its parent GPT 3.5 going out in the world and dominating human beings, because it doesn't know how to operate in the world. It doesn't know how to drive a car. It doesn't know how to shoot a gun. It's not a threat to us at all, but it's really smart and it's really impressive. And I think it's wonderful that humans are going to keep being able to do this. Uh, does this say anything about substrate independence? Well, I think it's really amazing that this program is running on the supercomputer at Microsoft using vast amounts of energy, I'm sure, but it can do it because they tend to put these kinds of giant computers close to places where electrical energy is easily generated, like hydro dams. So the energy matters to it. It's very different from humans. But the thing is, we can use this as part of some amazing teams where we can use the benefits of human brain power and these additional sources, which I think are really quite wonderful.
absolutely. Well, Paul, on that note, let me thank you again so much for your time today. And let me close by asking this. If we can achieve substrate independent minds, some kind of digital immortality or something along that nature, do you think that that may come at the cost of losing something unquantifiable that currently makes us more than just machines?
Well, what makes humans human? That's actually something I've written about, because in 2010, I published a book called The Brain and the Meaning of Life. And so let me give you my short answer. There's a much longer answer of what makes lives meaningful. It's love, work, and play. So work part, well, the computers are already doing pretty well, but the love part and the play part, those require emotions. So loving, having these relationships, and play requires fun. And so human emotions are a big part of what makes our lives meaningful. We're not going to lose that. And I don't think computers are going to gain that, because they don't have the kind of bodies we've got. And so they can help us with our work, but we can continue having wonderful, meaningful lives with love and play and get help from our work at the same time.
Wonderful. Paul, thank you again so much for your time, sir.
Thank you very much.